All right, so let's talk about mongoose. So mongoose is a library that allows us to very quickly, very easily connect to the Mongo database and somewhat recoup some of the things that we lost when we went from relational databases to a non-relational database, right? So some of the things such as schema definition, validation when we're doing inserts or updates, some of the things that we take for granted when when we're working on relational databases, such as also things such as being somewhat being able to do something that looks like a join, but not quite. But this would all execute at the application level. So Mongoose is an application level library, right? That you use, from Node.js, from any application that you implement using JavaScript, right, to interact with MongoDB. So we already have a database that we created earlier. We're going to create here a simple Node.js application that we can then interact with MongoDB. So let's see. We actually might already have one, no? Let's see. Where are we? Right. So let's go into webdev, into 2019, to Spring. And so we already had created this node here, so it might as well just stay there. We had hello.js, data, so let's open it up with our favorite IDE. So let's close this. And let's see, do we have it here? Must be this one, webdev, that one, yep. All right, and created a couple of services. We had created some of this widget mock that we were able to. Okay, we did some session, playing around with the session, widget user service. Excellent. Okay, so let's stay here. So what we're going to do is that we already have created a Node application. We did not initialize for Git. Let's leave that for later. We're going to install now the mongoose library. So let's do that. So that's going to download the mongoose library and it's going to install it in node_modules. Excellent. Let's keep going. And so what we're going to do is that we're going to try and connect to the database, right? And I invite you to take a look at the library website, right, to look at the documentation. So if you look at the documentation, it gives you couple lines of code to connect to a database very easily. Just require the mongoose library, and then you can connect if you know the URL of where the library, where that server is running, right? And then you can start interacting with the database. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to do it in a file, in a dedicated file, and we'll call it, instead of data db.js, we'll put in there everything that has to do with connecting to the database, authenticating and whatnot. So let's do that. So in data, we're going to create db.js, and in there we're going to copy this content. So let's go over this a bit. Right? So notice that this is a function that is being exposed, right? Exported so that folks can require this class. Right? What they're going to get back is this function over here, right? Whatever this function returns, right? In here, what we're doing is that we're requiring the mongoose library. Notice this mongoose doesn't have any dot in front of it, so the first place that's going to look for it is in the node_modules. Okay. Also, here we're just building the name of the database that we want to connect to. I think we have Mongo still running, so we're going to show DBs. So the database here is whiteboard SP19. So let's change that. That's where we want to connect to. And here's the connection string. This connection string is the string that's going to be used to connect to the database. It's a MongoDB. In this case, it's localhost. It's going to use the default port number. If I don't specify it, it'll use the default port number. Or if I know the IP address, I could also use the IP address, right? This could be running anywhere in the world. You can connect to it if you have credentials. You can also provide username and password if you have them, or if you need them, appended to the connection string. We're just building here the connection string, and we're going to say connect to the connection string. Okay. All right. So we have that. We need to run that. We're going to run it from our server. This is our entry point to our middle tier application, right? This is server.js. That's the server that's going to be listening for incoming HTTP requests. So from here is where we're going to connect to that database, right? Actually, we're going to connect to it really early on over here, right after connecting to the Express. We're going to var import DB. So we say require. Actually, we don't even need the local database. So we're going to say require, and we're going to go down to data and then DB. There it is, right? It's a function, so I'm going to call the function that comes back from that, right? Like as I call the function, this is not really returning anything. I just want to execute it, right, so that it connects to a database, and after that, the database is up and running, and I can start talking to it. Okay. All right. So once that happens, we want to be able to start communicating with the database, and the way we communicate is through defining a schema, right? Just like we would expect if this was a relational database, right? We want to be able to define what the structure of the data is, and then making sure that every time we insert or we do some updates, whatnot, it's always validated against the schema. There's no such support in Mongo. Right? Instead, it's going to be delegated at the application level, and that's where we are now. So I want to create a couple of schemas here under the models directory. I'm going to create a models directory. So this is a good practice, to put just dedicated directories here for specific types of things. Right? For instance, all the services that respond to any incoming HTTP request live on the service under the services directory. Yes, right? And all our data modeling efforts are going to live under the models directory. Okay. In particular, we're going to create a schema for the user. Right? So in here in the models, we're going to create a file called user.schema.server.js. If you remember, this is still following the naming convention that we've been using both on the front end and also in the middle tier, right? That the user is kind of like the feature or what is it that we're working on, right? What are we talking about? Schema is the role of this file. This file is declaring a schema, right? Then this is on the server. So this is a file that is being executed on the server. So it's a schema. It's a user schema on the server. There could be a schema also on the client as well, right? But this is for the server. So on the server, the way we declare a schema is from using the mongoose library, and the mongoose library provides a schema. Right? We can say mongoose.schema, a function, right, that can take as argument the declaration of the definition of a schema, right? And that schema is defined using a JSON object that has name-value pairs. That's saying that I'm going to create a brand new schema that has the following fields, and each of these fields has these data types. Okay, so a username is going to be string, password is string, first name is string. These are all strings. Everybody good? Okay. Additionally, we're going to also so schema takes two arguments. The first argument is the structure of the data, and the second argument says where do you want to store it in Mongo? What collection do you want to map it to? Right? If you forget this name, this user, it will choose one for you. Okay, a default name, which we'll see in a minute. But you can override it here by saying exactly what do you want to use for the name of the collection, the underlying collection that's going to be stored in the database. Everybody okay? All right. And finally, we're exporting the schema so that other folks can import this and use it elsewhere. Yes? This is a good practice of defining a schema in a separate file so that it can be used in multiple places wherever you need it. Right? It could be that this is a schema embedded in some other models. Right? So that model might need to access this schema. Or it could be another model that's specific to this schema. So you can have multiple model files that use the same schema in multiple places. So it's a good practice to declare it in its own file outright. Okay. All right. So we have a schema. Let's now create a data access object. A data access object is a design pattern that encapsulates all the operations that you're gonna do with a database, right? For instance, a repository is a type of data access object, right? It's a pretty standard. It implements the DAO pattern by providing the find all, find by ID, create, update, delete. Yes. It provides all this implementation for you out of the box. It's a data access object. Here we're going to have to implement that ourselves. Okay, so a DAO is going to have a somewhat of a high-level API to interact with the low-level data in the database. Right? It's going to use what Mongoose is going to give us. It's the equivalent of a repository. It's going to give us an equivalent of a repository. If you remember, the repository in JPA was fairly generic, right? It had a find by ID, right? It had a find all. Remember that? It had a save, it had an update, it had a delete by ID. Remember that? Okay. But typically, on top of that, we typically built our own interface, right? Instead of in terms of find by ID, we created find user by ID, find widget by ID, right? We wrapped the low-level interface that talked to the database directly. We defined an interface around that had a higher level, right? Had something that meant something to us specifically in our particular domain. Make sense? So that's what the DAO is going to do. The DAO is going to use a low-level mongoose data model. Right, it's going to wrap it around a high-level interface. Okay? All right. So we're going to create a DAO here. The DAO is also a fairly well-known design pattern and best practice. Again, the naming convention. The user is the feature that we're working on. The DAO is the role of the file, is declaring a DAO, and it's running on the server. So what we're going to do here is first we're going to load the mongoose library. We're going to load the schema which we just defined. Right, we just defined that schema. There it is. We have it right there. And what we're going to do is that we're going to declare a mongoose model. This is the equivalent of the repository. Right? The mongoose library declares a function called model. Right? This model creates for us, right, an object that has an API that allows us to create, insert, update, delete, right, talk to the specific collection in the database. Right? It takes two arguments. One of the arguments is a unique identifier. Right? This has to be unique across the entire application. Right? You can't use this string anywhere else, right, for Mongoose anyway. The second argument is the schema, right? Meaning that all operations of insert, update, right? All those operations are going to be verified and validated against that schema. If you try to insert something that doesn't follow this schema, it'll ignore it'll throw an error, or will not allow us, or will ignore some of the fields and whatnot. Yes? Okay. So all operations to a database will be validated against that schema. Everybody good? Right. Now this name, it could be whatever you want, but commonly it's the best practice is to use the name of the collection, right, followed by model. Right. That's a very common naming convention. Now, if in the schema you would not have overwritten this collection here, right? If you wouldn't have overwritten it, it would have used this name as a default name for the collection, right? It would have used user model as the name of the collection, all right? Whatever model you chose here. But we actually know that there's a collection already that exists in that database, doesn't it? With a couple of faculties, a couple of students, yes? All right, we're going to try and connect to that and try to retrieve username, password, first name, last name that already exists in the database. Right? We know, and then we know the collection is called user. Okay, so we'll connect to that. Excellent. What else? All right, so the other thing is that we're going to export this user model. We're going to export that user model so that folks that want to use it, right, they can use it outside of this file. All right, excellent. All right, so let's see what else. All right, let's try it out. Let's play around with this brand new DAO that we just created. Okay, so let's create here a little test. Another best practice is to, inside of the models directory, create a directory specific for each one of your collections, and have the schema and the model file both inside of that directory. Right, so they're all a subset in there. You could put in there also some mock data. You could put some tests. Anything that's specific to dealing with user. Right, like for instance, let's put here a test in here. So this might be user.test. So in here, we're going to do some tests. Right, so we're going to use that. We're going to require this DAO. So we're going to say const DAO equal require, and we're going to require the user.dao. Okay, and one of the things that we can do is since it's exporting the model itself, this is exporting the low-level repository, almost like the repository. This has all the low-level generic functions that allow you to interact with the database, with that collection. For instance, one of the things that we can do with the DAO, right, which is basically this user model, right? That's what's being exported. We could do find. This is the same find that you would type at the command line, right, if you were working in the Mongo client. But the difference is that we're doing it programmatically here, right? We can tie it to HTTP services. We can do all sorts of operations. Now the difference is that here, this Node.js might be a server that is running, it's an HTTP server that is serving all sorts of static data and serving all sorts of information for the client, and it could be running in a particular machine, halfway across the world. Now the database itself could be also in a completely different machine running another halfway across the world, right? So in opposite poles of the globe. So this find function by default is a asynchronous operation, right? It doesn't block waiting for the response from the remote database server running halfway across the world for it to respond. Right? Instead, it uses the promises library that we have been using on the client side. Here too, it's the same identical API, right? That uses the then and except and all that good stuff that we already learned. So what we can do here is that we can say then, or tie it here. We can say then, and here we would get the response, and then we can do a console log the response. Okay. All right. So let's play around with this. Let's run this. Let's create a configuration, a brand new node configuration, so we can run our test. And our test is inside. Where is it? Let's see. No, that's not it. Really, you're gonna have to make me navigate all the way down. 2019 spring. I think that's that one, right? Yeah, it's that one. Inside of models, user, there it is, that one. We're going to say open. And the node version 10. And we're going to, this is test, right? So user test. Is it user test? Yeah. So apply, okay, and let's run that. Right, so let's run that. And it didn't do anything. Wait, what? Find user test, exit. Are we even in here? All right, so we are there. DAO. Oh, we might need to actually connect to a database. That would be a good idea. So database is where? It's up here in the data. So let's do a cons. So let's we're going to say require go up one, down to data. Require. We're down here. We're going to have to go up twice, and then data, and then DB. There it is. All right, so that's going to connect us to a database. Do we need to call it? It is a function. All right, so we need to call that. Let's run that again. There it is. So now it connected to the database first, right, and then just ran and retrieved all the information in the database, right? So Ada, Tim, John, Jane, right? All the information is there. Everybody good? Right? Again, notice that find is a generic function, right? It's not find user, find anything, right? It's just a very generic function, right? And it has the same, the same types of API that you would expect from the command line, right? So you could say, I only want the ones where the username is Ada. Right? So if we run that again, notice that it only returns Ada. Make sense? All right. Also notice that it returns as an array. It returns as an array. Find always returns an array. Right? It returns all the documents that match the criteria. If you know there's only one, because you know that username is a unique key, right? There's a syntactic sugar, right? We could notice that the response we can say, well, we know these are users, so we can say this is users, and these are users, and let's make this a little more readable. And so if you know it's one, you could just say, well, I want only the first one, right? And indeed, it only returns the first one over here, right? But there's a syntactic sugar that if you know username is a unique field, you know there's only just one of these objects. It makes no sense to deal with arrays, right? So typically you can say find one, right? Because you know there's only one, so you don't need to do this anymore, and you know this is only a single user. All right, so if you run, now it returns just one user. Make sense? And there's a whole bunch of these syntactic sugars that wrap some of the low-level APIs or into something that's a little more usable. Okay? All right, so let's keep going here. Let's see. We retrieved the database, DAOs. We created the DAO. All right, so let's create a couple of more interesting things in this DAO.